Mission and Margin is the business of healthcare.
I learned very quickly about inclusion, about using the tools and resources that are available, and most importantly, the importance of relationships. When we talk about mentoring, typically we think about, the older, more experienced individual mentors like the younger generation. But I find, even in my experience, I'm being mentored by this younger generation, particularly when it comes to social media and technology and, applications and different tools that are out there to use just to make work faster and easier and more concise. So I think it goes two ways now, and that is, I think that's just an interesting dynamic to continue to watch.
And we do have a philosophy at GE Healthcare that everybody in the company is a leader, because it's about influence and it's not title. And so how do you continue to grow your influencing skills and serve others? Because I think solving the challenge of healthcare, and I'm not the only one that's ever said this, it's going to take everybody in the ecosystem and even players outside the ecosystem that aren't there. And the old mentality was let's build it or buy it. Mm-hmm. The new mentality is build, buy, partner. But understanding the economics and the business of healthcare is vital to be able to understand how do you solve a problem.
That was Shelley Buck of WellSpan Health and Joe Gaskew of GE Healthcare, who discussed inclusive leadership. Inclusive leadership seeks not so much to guard against discrimination as it does to harness differences in age, cultures, origins, and experiences as competitive advantage. GE Healthcare, St. Louis University, the Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Management Education, and Jefferson College of Population Health made it possible to record this interview during CAHME's 50th anniversary celebration. Shelley Buck is Vice President, Chief Operating Officer, and Chief Nursing Officer at York Hospital, the flagship facility in WellSpan Health. Buck's leadership journey began providing end-of-life care while still in high school, then followed by progressively more complex responsibilities in critical care nursing, hospital operations, and health system management. She harnesses two-way mentorship and coaching to cross-pollinate ideas across the 5 generations she leads. Joe Gaskew, GE Healthcare's Chief Marketing Officer for the U.S. and Canada, returns to business of healthcare to share the unique qualities he observes in high-performing, emerging healthcare leaders. He sees inclusiveness as a way to stay agile and grounded in an industry experiencing rapid and constant change. He also points out the risks of over-indexing, especially in cross-departmental decision-making. Shelley Buck, Joe Gaskew, thank you so much for joining the business of healthcare.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Great to be here.
You've led an illustrious career in healthcare, starting in nursing as a youth. Tell me about how you got started in healthcare.
Sure. I actually started in healthcare when I was in high school. And having completed a lot of my college, prerequisites, I was a little bored, didn't have much to do. And my parents said that you can't stop school now, you can't graduate a year early, so figure it out. And so I absolutely did, and I was fortunate enough to go to a high school that offered a work study program, and one of the work tasks, or I should say skills that they developed, in individuals was a certified nursing assistant skill. And so I took the class and I earned my certification in the state of New Jersey and proceeded to work in long-term care.
Wow.
And that's how I got started in nursing.
What was it that was so influential in the experience early in your career that drew you in, that made you want to pursue healthcare?
Well, I was fortunate enough to work with a nurse that I thought was just an angel of mercy. She was the most wonderful woman I had ever met at that point in my life. And she demonstrated such care and compassion to the residents that lived in this nursing home. She actually pushed me beyond my comfort level and had me sit with a patient that was at the end of life. And though it was a little difficult for me at the age of 17 to sit in the room, she encouraged me to stay close by so that I could hear as the patient passed on. And in doing that, it really touched me to see how compassionate she was, how she spoke with the patient's son and consoled him during this time, and the work that she did with the physician to ensure that the patient was actually comfortable, the resident was comfortable. And so just seeing her work through all of this and then feeling my own emotion, because I had taken care of this resident for a number of months, and so I had grown attached to her, so I was feeling the loss as well. But she embraced all of the care, compassion, the work, the transition from life to death, and me, and said, Shelley, this is part of nursing. Now I want you to come and help prepare the body, after the patient had passed on. And we talked about, that the dying process, and we talked about the transition of life. And from that point on, I thought this is a wonderful thing to be able to, help people heal, help people become whole again, as well as transition from life to death in a very respectful and compassionate way. And I wanted to be a part of that.
Yeah. Joe, for you, I know that leadership, you've played significant leadership roles across the commercial organization at GE, but I know that your interest in leadership comes from also a very powerful story. Tell us a little bit about where your first leadership lesson came from.
Yeah, so my first leadership lesson, which I didn't realize at the time, but in reflecting on it later in life, along my leadership journey to try to learn who I was as a leader, went through a session kind of going back through your life of the ups and downs, and that the things that form you into the leader that you are. And for me, what I realized is, one, people told me that I was kind of cool and calm under fire, and I was always positive. I was like, so where did that come from? And in this kind of reflection, I went back to when in my childhood, my father passed away. And so two sisters and a mom that during that tumultuous time frame, would always kind of rally around and say, what are we going to do to me? And so that's where, being confident, but saying, we can do this together, and about how do we kind of continue to look glass half full and look forward, not back, and staying cool under pressure is kind of, that's what would galvanize that within me, which I didn't realize until several years into, I would say, leadership roles. So now, when I have the opportunity to mentor or speak with groups, I share the story in a sense of not because it's my story, but because I think it's a powerful time to spend just reflecting personally on what makes you who you are, and it's usually those life experiences, good and bad, and how you adjust to those, and then that's how you then show up, and so that's what I learned.
As you grew into your career, you then went on to critical care nursing,
I did.
And then went on to leadership within
Yes.
critical care nursing. What was that transition to leadership like? What was the impetus of that transition for you?
Well, while in critical care, working as a nurse in a neuroscience ICU, I had the opportunity to introduce a unlicensed assistive personnel role. Today we call those patient care techs.
Okay.
And the patient care tech role was brand new to this large academic teaching institution. And in most academic teaching institutions, you have, excellent quality. You have nurses that are very dedicated and very detailed, particularly those in the ICU. And that's what I'm most familiar with. When it comes to their patient care, they want to know that everything is done, and they pride themselves on delivering excellent outcomes. And so I was in that type of environment. And so to introduce a role that was new and different, that assigned some of the tasks that nurses were comfortable and accustomed to doing to this brand new role was threatening, to say the least. And so I had to work with the nursing staff within this unit to understand what exactly the role would do, how it would complement and support them to provide better care and to ensure that we had better outcomes. And so that took some time to do. It was a lot of discussion, a lot of training and educating the staff, but I got them to the point where they were comfortable allowing this new role to come into the unit. And from there, it just blossomed and grew. So once the nurses were comfortable working with the patient care technicians, the duties and tasks that they were assigned, that list also grew. And so with that, we were able to identify a savings in nursing hours, as well as improve our outcomes with patient care, because we were able to mobilize them faster, decrease the incidence of pressure ulcers, and so the patients were more mobile because we had more hands, that could really help us move the patients, as well as I said, capture some savings both with rental services if we were renting, beds for patients to move because we had more hands on. And so with that, I was also assigned the responsibility of supervising the patient care technicians. And so that's where
if you're going to bring them in here, you are now responsible for them.
Exactly. And so that's where that all started.
Wow.
And so I just loved it. I loved working with the team of nurses that I worked with, and I loved working with the patient care technicians, identifying their strengths, getting them better equipped and skilled to do the job that they were hired to do, and transitioning the culture, to one that was now more open, one that was more inclusive of a different role, a change in the practice. So I just stuck with it. Shortly thereafter, I moved into a manager role and was asked to open a unit, or I should say reopen a unit that had been closed because of the level of quality and the safety issues that were associated with this unit. And this was in a different hospital, so I ended up leaving the one organization to go to a new hospital to reopen a unit. And within 1 year's time, the unit was reopened. We hired 50% of the original staff and 50% of the new staff back. And we had exceptional quality and outcomes. And it was funny because one of the key surgeons that were admitting to this unit told me that he was instrumental in getting the unit closed. And he told me that when I first started.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I hope you'll be instrumental in keeping this unit open.
Right.
And I knew I had done my job when I saw an order that was written by him that said, for his patient, that said, I only want my patient to go to my unit.
Yeah, that is a certification.
Yes.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
Over your career, you've had a lot of leadership influencers. You've had mentors. Tell me about a mentor that's really had a significant impact on you.
I have had several, and I think one of the things that I think we all have to do as leaders, and to me it never stops. It's a journey. So how do you continue each and every day to try to improve? And we do have a philosophy at GE Healthcare that everybody in the company is a leader, because it's about influence and it's not title. And so how do you continue to grow your influencing skills and serve others? But for me, I've had several folks along the way that have helped me do that. And I was actually coached early on to have a personal board of directors. So not just my immediate leader, not just an HR resource, but other folks that were confidants in a trusting relationship that I could go to with the tough questions, or maybe the dumb questions, or maybe the vulnerable questions. And so I've been fortunate enough to always kind of have that board of directors, and as you grow in your career, that changes sometimes who those are. I would also say that at each step along the journey, in 18 years at the company, 8 or 9 different leaders that I've worked for, it's always been the right leader at the right time. One, I think that's attitude, and 2, I think it's being open to coaching, and then 3, I just I think have been phenomenally have been lucky in that sense to have great people at the right time in my career to help me grow. So that's been my experience.
Tell me about a striking leadership lesson that you've learned in your career.
I'd say early on in leadership, I've learned a lesson that I will never forget and always carry with me. And that was during a time when I was tasked with opening an admission, discharge, and transfer unit, or we call it an ADT. And in doing so, I thought I had gathered the right people together to open this unit, and those individuals included transportation, the nursing department, the unit secretary, the logistics team, so people that assign the beds, and a few other individuals. And as I was opening this unit that sat between 2 medical cardiac telemetry units, I would watch the physicians walk through the unit, because it was right in the middle of the 2. They would walk through the unit and they'd ask me questions like, so what are you doing? So what's going here? And what type of patient will be placed here? These questions. But I was so focused on just completing the task that I forgot about the inclusion of key stakeholders. And the physicians were, of course, key stakeholders. And so as we put our proposal together and the presentation more so for the Medical Executive Committee and for the board, and stood there and presented, I, because it wasn't really a we at that point, I stood there and got riddled with questions. And some, not really questions, but a little heated comments and conversations started to ensue, simply because I had forgotten some of the key stakeholders, the people that needed to be included, particularly the physicians, and even some of the back office functions were excluded from that process. So I learned very quickly about project management, about inclusion, about using the tools and resources that are available, to ensure that you never make that mistake again. And most importantly, the importance of relationships.
Yeah.
And maybe to add on to that a little bit, because I think that I've learned that lesson too myself. But I've over-indexed sometimes as well around kind of thinking through a change acceleration process and identifying key stakeholders and getting input, and then maybe taking too long because maybe I went too broad. And so a lesson I've had even in the last few years of there's a speed component that you want to move with, so you want to be agile while you want to make sure that the key stakeholders are involved, and especially in an organization like GE Healthcare that's very matrix in nature. So making sure as you identify the key stakeholders, yes, to do that and get input, but realize that doesn't have to be 30 people. It can be 5 that have the ability to say no. Now the other 25 might not have the ability to say no, but they think they do. So how do you make sure you discern that? Because there is a speed component of change that you want to move forward with too. So I've over-indexed on both sides, and trying to strike the balance was what I continue to work on.
Yeah, that phrase over-indexing, it's an interesting way of thinking about it. You do have different cultures that probably affect what that ratio is, right? I would imagine, in general, health systems, probably that sweet spot is probably more inclusive, and perhaps more, as you get more into commercial enterprise, the ability to ratchet that back might be different.
It's an interesting question. I think historically in our organization, we've been trying to break down silos. So when you're in the process of breaking down silos, and I like to refer to it as the vertical and the horizontal, and there's a balance. If you're too vertical, you might have a lot of speed, but you're not leveraging the breadth and depth of the whole portfolio, or the whole ability to solve client problems. So how do you optimize the horizontal input and the vertical input? And as we shifted from more vertical to bring in that horizontal lens, you have to go slow sometimes to go fast. And once you work through with different colleagues a few challenges, then it's kind of the speed to trust, then you can go faster next time. So at least is my experience, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think in the acute care setting in healthcare systems, you have to have the right stakeholders. And like Joe said, it may not be 30, it may not be everyone, but you have to ensure that the right departments are represented. But two, also in healthcare, we're breaking down those silos. We too look at the horizontal and the vertical, because typically most organizations have service lines, and so your service line, can, you're smiling, so you know about this. Your service lines can have not by intent, but exclude some other key stakeholders in the way that they're working and managing. And so you lose some of your operational efficiency, you lose some of the, as you said, the breadth and the depth of operations and decisions and the way that the organization would run. So it's important to just find that balance, and every project doesn't have to be managed the exact same way, but you just have to make sure that you have the right people making the right decisions at the right time.
You made an observation when we were preparing for this about the number of generations represented in the workforce that you serve. I think you made the point essentially five generations across, and in particular, you sort of characterize perhaps the differences between some of the late careerists versus early careerists. Talk a little bit about that.
I did. I find it interesting now. During this point in healthcare that we have a generation, and I call them kind of like your silver leaders, that they're part of the silver tsunami, that will be retiring in the next 5 to 10 years. And yet we also have the millennials that are well into the workforce now that are looking for leadership roles. So they come in and get maybe 3 to 5 years of experience, and then they want, to be a director and a vice president, and they want to move up very quickly. And so I think there's benefits to that mentality and I think strategy in their career, pursuing their career. But also there's a value in the knowledge and there's wisdom, that the silver leaders, have that they need to share with the millennials. I think the challenge and what's very interesting for me to watch is that, the push and the pull, the decision making, changes, the processes that have to change based on each individual group's, I think, philosophy and belief on how a hospital should run or a healthcare system should run. And so I think there's a perfect blend somewhere. I don't think that we're there just yet with leadership styles, but definitely one needs to learn and can and will and usually does learn from the other. It's both ways. When we talk about mentoring, typically we think about the older, more experienced individual mentors like the younger generation. But I find, even in my experience, I'm being mentored by this younger generation, particularly when it comes to social media and technology and applications and different tools that are out there to use just to make work faster and easier and more concise. So I think it goes 2 ways now, and that is, I think that's just an interesting dynamic to continue to watch.
Is it possible that we may be coming to a situation where the things that are changing in healthcare and the future that we face in healthcare is such that some of our silver leaders don't have the knowledge or experience to teach the younger generation?
I think that's so. I do. I think that's a reality that we face. When we look at, we'll use something most people know, telemedicine. When we look at that and the technology for using telemedicine. We started first with putting an EKG machine in the home with a scale, and it uploads to the internet, and the information about the patient is then downloaded to a computer in the office. Today we can walk around with our smartphones and get a physician visit sitting in the parking lot of some convenience store somewhere if you have to, right? And so that's not always comfortable. That degree of change, may not be comfortable to some of our more silver leaders because it's technology and it's a way of providing care and services that they probably didn't develop, weren't familiar with. They didn't get to where they are using this particular, if we stick with telemedicine, this particular platform and type of care delivery. And so there's learning that has to happen there, with our silver leaders, as well. So it's interesting. Like I said, it's interesting to watch. Yeah.
Now you have 50 or so new hires that come through each year in your 2-year leadership training program. And I can imagine there must be an enormous amount of examples or observations that you have of what these younger upcoming leaders are sort of bringing to the table in terms of their view of the world and the lessons that they bring for your own senior leaders. Tell me, does that resonate with you at all?
It does. So first, it gives me hope because they're phenomenal. Just phenomenal individuals, but also phenomenal team players, which I think we drastically need as we try to solve challenges within healthcare. But 2, what I've been very inspired by is how inquisitive they are. And we're really pushing on a culture overall of how do you continue to learn each and every day. So kind of a learn it culture versus a know it culture. And kind of in this aspect of 5 generations in the workforce, they're inspiring, I think, and the input they're having in our culture is that thirst for knowledge, also a thirst for feedback on a regular basis. Also, they're extremely inquisitive, and if you think of great mentor-mentor relationships, it's coaching skills would say we should ask more questions. And they ask great questions. And then the other thing that we're pushing on, which I think they do well too, is listen, to understand versus listen to respond. And so I know in the conversations I've had or mentor-mentee relationships that I've had, it quickly, when it's working right, it quickly becomes a mutual benefit all the way around. And then I think that, again, it's back to asking great questions, listening, let that other person come up with their own thoughts from their challenge versus telling them what they should do. And in that, I think then I'm learning a lot in the process as well.
Tell me about a mentee that you've had or an emerging leader that you've worked with that you've been really struck by.
Wow, I have an example of both.
Okay.
A mentor that I've had, this was a CEO that I thought was just remarkable. He knew how to push the envelope, challenge our thinking. He didn't settle for second best. He really pushed for excellence and kept the bar raised very, very high. And so his door was always open, and when we struggled with trying to meet the expectations or the goal, he was always there to coach you. Mm-hmm. He was always there to point out, what you're doing well, but more importantly, for leaders like myself, what was I doing wrong? Mm-hmm. And then give you pointers on how to get there while hearing, the way that you processed the issue or the situation. He could come across as very commanding and even demanding, but once you saw past that and you understood the intent of that presentation, that he just wanted everyone, all ships to rise. He just wanted everybody to do wonderful. Yeah. And if one person did great, the expectation was that you help somebody else. Yeah. Right? Michael Robinson. Okay. That was the leader.
Okay. Bon Secours. Okay.
Yeah. Michael Robinson. I also had the pleasure of working with a young man that was completing his master's in health administration through his residency. And he had experience as a banker. He had been an athlete in football. He was a pro athlete. Wow. He was in arena football. He went to one of my favorite colleges, William and Mary, right? Because my daughter went there, so he went to one of my favorite colleges.
You're financially committed to them.
Exactly, I am. And he was just a joy to work with. Yeah. He had worked with underprivileged children, opened his own foundation, to fund children's experiences so that they could get out of the city and be exposed to, the opportunities of life.
Yeah.
So just dynamic young man. And so he came to me in a residency, and through the residency, he got, experience working in healthcare and understanding nursing and then operations, and we kept him on afterwards. And he brought a way of thinking and problem solving that I hadn't seen before, and that the team hadn't seen before.
Because what was it that was different about his way of thinking?
It was all based on what he learned when he was a pro athlete. Any given day, somebody is working harder than you to take your job. And so if you think about it that way, you will always try to bring, and this is what he would tell us, you would always try to ensure that you were on your A game and that you worked a little bit harder, right, to make sure you hit your goal and your outcome, because someone could move in and take your position. Yeah. And he lived that experience. It happened to him.
Wow.
And so as the team sat around, and sometimes, when you wrestle with problems and you think, how am I going to get to a rate of 0 hospital-acquired infections? Is that even possible? Right?
Yep.
Well, we want to believe that it is possible because no one wants to be that one person. No one wants to be that one person to get sepsis and die.
Right.
So we have to believe that it is possible, and we have to figure out how to do it. So as we sit and we challenge our way of thinking and solving the problem, and oftentimes you get kind of you feel like you're just kind of beat up with the issue, and you just can't figure it out. And he would always say, there's somebody out there that can come in and figure this out. Mm-hmm. I think we have to do it before they come in.
And do it.
So that put a different spin on the room, right?
Right.
And so we would take a little break and come back and okay, dig deeper in the research. And if we can't find it, then we need to create it, right? And so we would just keep pressing on and pressing on. So he brought an interesting way of thinking about how to tackle issues.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What do you think are the most important things that have changed? What is so different today that a new leader faces that just didn't exist at the time that you became a leader?
I think it's the pace of change. So if you don't like change, it's the slowest it'll ever be today. So it's the pace of change and being able to live through ambiguity. And I think also how do you prioritize your day, your week, your month, because there's so much going on. And the ability to do that, I mean, it's hard. It's hard to do that. Some call it the whirlwind. How do you manage the whirlwind and still achieve the most crucial things that you need to achieve?
Yeah.
So I think the change aspect and the prioritization aspect are two big things that I think we continue to struggle with each and every day. And I know I'm working on the prioritization side.
Mm-hmm. Shelley, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree. It's definitely the pace.
Yep.
And leaders today, they have to be agile, they have to be nimble, they have to be flexible. And what got us here today isn't going to get us to tomorrow. I mean, it just really isn't. And so we have to be open to, trying, different approaches. And if the evidence isn't there, that doesn't mean we don't do it. I think we're accustomed to, relying on the data, and the research and having that help guide us. And that's, I think is the exact way, or one of the exact ways, I should say, that we should practice. But if it's not there, we have to create it. And then we have to take calculated risks. And I think now in today's world, we're taking more risks, with care and how we, achieve the outcome, achieve like high quality or patient satisfaction, things like that. So
for clinical leaders, how different is the need for understanding the business of healthcare today versus when you were a critical care nurse?
Very different. My nurses at the bedside, I call them my frontline leaders, at the bedside, they have to understand the budget. They have to understand, where we can remove cost, how we can make an organization lean. They have to understand lean management, and lean principles. They have to think differently about the way that we provide service and satisfaction to patients. So they have to understand that. And before, we really didn't have to understand that, a lot. The quality, metrics that are required that we meet so that we can receive incentives from our different payers. They just have to understand all of that business because they're a part of making the change. So they're a part of creating the new processes, the policies, working with the physicians and the providers to drive and change, the care that we're delivering to our patients so that we can meet these outcomes. So they have to be very knowledgeable in all of those areas.
And I would imagine there's a parallel in your commercial organization. The creativity, for example, that GE has undertaken in entering into shared risk contracts where you're truly sharing in the risks, the rewards, the bad outcomes. That I would imagine that is a very, very different set of skills you need in your commercial organization to undertake that.
Completely different than the way we used to train before, or actually even skill sets that we look for. But as we try to make sure that we're customer obsessed and solving an outcome, clinical, operational, or financial outcome, the business of healthcare, we have to know it and be part of it, because I think solving the challenge of healthcare, and I'm not the only one that's ever said this, I mean, it's going to take everybody in the ecosystem and even players outside the ecosystem that aren't there. And the old mentality was let's build it or buy it. The new mentality is build, buy, partner. And so I think that's also a skill set that back to that, how do you problem solve and do that in a horizontal way, but understanding the economics and the business of healthcare is vital to be able to understand how do you solve a problem. So yes, I would say we're early in the journey over the last few years. So we have a big commercial organization, and we owe that to them. But we definitely are investing time and effort in how do we do that.
Shelley, when you think about your strategic commercial partners, what are the things that you love to take advantage of from their leadership world? What's the what is the cross-pollination opportunity between WellSpan and GE Healthcare, or WellSpan and one of your other strategic partners?
I love to take advantage of their intellectual capital.
Huh?
That's what I really love. Partnering with them to figure out, solutions and how we get to the best outcome. Knowing that, and I'm a firm believer that, just because you're a clinician or you're within one industry doesn't mean that you can't bring in other individuals from other industries. We work very closely with a lot of engineers, in looking at how we can improve our efficiencies in operations and remove any waste, under a lean methodology. And so that's relatively new in healthcare today. I'd say 20 years ago, we didn't have engineers coming into, hospitals to help us redesign the way that we manage and we care for patients. So I'm a big proponent, of that. And so I think we need to do that more. Yeah, we need to do that more.
And I recall you sharing a story with me about one of your senior HR leaders going and spending a day with one of your clients just to talk a little bit about the sorts of things that you find valuable in the knowledge transfer to the provider organization.
It's a great question, a little bit along the lines of intellectual capital. Back to the partnership side of the equation is what are the aspects that we can bring that might be beneficial and vice versa. So focusing on the patient and patient outcomes is something that we love working with clients on because they live it and feel it and breathe it each and every day. Our engineers back developing products might not feel it, sense it, and breathe it every day. So that's definitely a gap that we try to work with clients on. On our side, it's HR practices, for instance, is one of the things that we spent time with clients on, not as an engagement, but more of a best practice sharing session. So how do we do talent succession? How do we do talent reviews? And aspects like that and the tools that we use. And for instance, we just developed an app a few years ago, and the term feedback sometimes doesn't feel great. Hey, can I give you some feedback? So we changed it, and it's consider and continue, and you can do it right on your phone. And so we have an interaction, and you continue this, and you might want to consider this. And so it's a way to kind of give constant feedback. So we
consider, like, continue, like this thing you're doing great, continue. This thing you might want to consider. Is that sort of the idea?
Yes, exactly. So the consider is the constructive feedback,
right.
Moniker. But it's a way, and back a little bit to the generation scenario that we were talking about, 5 generations in the workforce. The earlier generations do want more regular feedback. They don't want an annual performance review. They want regular feedback, and this is one way we're trying to tackle that problem. Not because the app solves all the problems. We just want to make sure the conversation happens. So whether the conversation happens and you never use the app, that's great, as long as the conversation's happening on a regular basis. But we have done that with clients around HR best practices, M&A best practices, things like that.
Thank you so much for joining the business of healthcare today. I truly appreciate the insights that you both have brought as it relates to leadership and the changing market.
Thank you.
Thank
Great
you.
conversation.
Yeah, it's good.
You can find more interviews at bohseries.com or search for Business of Healthcare and our red logo wherever you listen to podcasts. TJ Ingracia was our videographer. Sophia Iga was our production assistant. Our thanks to GE Healthcare, the Commission on the Accreditation of Healthcare Management Education, St. Louis University, and the Jefferson College of Population Health for making this interview possible. I'm Matthew Hannes, founder and executive producer of Business of Healthcare.